All right, let's dive into some funny English mistakes. We've got tons of real-life examples, and some of them are so funny.
Oh, I bet.
I mean, we're talking like, I eat my fingers when I'm hungry, kind of funny. But, these mistakes are actually a great way to learn.
Absolutely.
So get ready to improve your English while we explore all these wild linguistic blunders.
What I find so interesting is how these mistakes often show the logic of the speaker's first language.
Yeah.
But it's like you can see their brain working, trying to translate directly, and it leads to some, pretty hilarious results.
Yeah, it's like your brain's trying to fit English into the mold of your native language.
Exactly.
And sometimes, it just doesn't quite work. So let's start with a classic. I'm boring when you really want to say I'm bored. I know we've all heard this one, but have you ever said it yourself? It's so easy to do.
Oh, it is. It is. And it all comes down to the difference between describing yourself as like inherently uninteresting versus how you feel at a certain moment.
Right.
In English, we use boring for qualities and bored for feelings.
Right. So if you're sitting around with nothing to do, you'd say I'm bored, not I'm boring.
Right. Unless you want everyone to think you're a snooze fest.
Exactly. Okay, how about this one? I have 20 years.
It seems logical.
Yeah, it does.
Like you have years of experience, so why not have years of age?
It's a very common mistake, probably because it's a direct translation from a lot of languages. But in English, we use the verb to be for age.
Okay.
So you'd say, I am 20 years old.
It's funny how our native language can really affect how we approach a new language,
I know.
It's like we're trying to force it into a box that doesn't quite fit.
It's true. But that's part of the fun.
Yeah.
Breaking out of that box and learning the unique ways English expresses things.
Okay, this next one always makes me laugh. My nose is running and my feet are smelling. It just paints such a funny picture in my mind.
I know, right? Like, can you imagine it? A nose sprinting across the room and some smelly feet chasing after it. It's hilarious. But of course, they're trying to say, my nose is runny and my feet smell. It's just that literal translation thing again.
It is. It is. We forget about those idiomatic expressions.
Okay, get ready for this one. I eat my fingers when I'm hungry. I've got to admit, I've been tempted to say something similar when I'm really hungry.
Oh, I bet.
But, nobody actually wants to see that.
Yeah, unless maybe you're a zombie or something.
Right. What they really mean is I eat finger foods when I'm hungry.
Exactly. This one really shows the importance of learning vocabulary in context. If you just learn the word finger by itself, it's easy to see how you could use it wrong.
Right, right. But when you learn it with finger food, it becomes much clearer.
And that's why it's so important to immerse yourself in the language.
Yeah, not just memorize word lists.
Exactly. It's all about the real life situations.
Okay, this next one can be a little tricky because it can lead to some awkward moments. Saying, I'm so hot, when you mean, I feel hot because of the weather.
Oh, yeah, that one's a classic.
Because in English, I'm hot can mean two totally different things.
Right, you could be talking about the temperature or something else.
Exactly. So if you say, I'm so hot on a sweltering day, someone might think you're flirting.
Oh, I can see that happening.
It's all about context.
Definitely.
To avoid any confusion, you could say, I feel hot because it's so warm outside.
Or even just, it's scorching today.
Right. It's important to be mindful of how what you say might be perceived, especially with phrases like that.
Absolutely. Different cultures have different norms, and what's considered polite in one place might not be in another.
Okay, here's another common mistake. Saying, let's go to the bed instead of let's go to bed. It seems like a small thing.
It does, but it makes a big difference.
In English, we don't usually use the before bed when we talk about going to sleep.
Right, it's just go to bed.
Because it's an idiomatic expression referring to the act of sleeping.
Exactly.
If you say go to the bed, it sounds like you're talking about a specific bed for some other reason.
Like, let's go to the bed to look for my keys.
Right, exactly. It's amazing how such a tiny grammatical detail can change the whole meaning.
It is, it is.
English has so many nuances. It's like there are a million little rules to remember.
There are a lot, but you don't have to memorize every single one.
Oh, thank goodness. So how can we master all these details without getting overwhelmed?
It's all about practice, practice, practice. The more you listen and read English, the more you'll pick up on these things naturally.
It's like learning a musical instrument.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The more you play, the better you get.
Okay, this next one I've definitely heard a lot. Do you want to sleep with me?
Oh, that one.
And no, we're not going there. But it's a perfect example of how a phrase that's totally innocent in one language can mean something very different in English.
Oh, yeah. It could lead to some very awkward misunderstandings. If you want to ask someone if they want to share a room, there are better ways to say it.
Right. You could say, do you want to share a room? Or would you like to stay in the same room?
Much better. And this mistake also highlights the importance of cultural differences. What might be totally normal in one culture can be completely inappropriate in another.
So when in doubt, it's always best to err on the side of caution and choose a more neutral way to say things.
Absolutely. Don't be afraid to ask for clarification if you're unsure about something. Most people are happy to help.
And, making these kinds of mistakes can actually be really helpful.
Oh, for sure.
It forces you to think about why it's wrong and how to do it right next time.
Exactly. It's all part of the learning process.
So let's embrace the blunders and use them to learn. We've got a lot more to cover, so stick with us for part 2 of our deep dive into these funny English mistakes.
Sounds good. Welcome back. These mistakes aren't just funny, they're super interesting.
Oh, totally. They show how our brains work when we learn languages.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we've got more lined up today that are sure to make you chuckle.
I can't wait.
Okay, so this next one can be a little tricky because it's often misinterpreted because of cultural differences. I'm pregnant with questions.
Oh, yeah, that one always gets me like, hold on, that's not how it works. But I can see how someone might say this, if they're trying to be really expressive.
I agree. It's probably a direct translation from a language where this kind of metaphor is totally normal.
Right.
But in English, it just sounds a little weird.
Yeah, it's not how we'd usually say we have a lot of questions. It's one of those phrases that makes you stop and think, wait, did they really just say that?
It definitely is. So a better way to say this in English would be something like, I have a lot of questions, or I'm bursting with questions.
Those are much clearer, and they avoid any awkwardness or misunderstandings. It's a good reminder that sometimes the simplest way to say something is the best, especially when you're trying to communicate across cultures.
Absolutely. Okay, let's switch gears to a grammar mistake that I see all the time, even from advanced learners. He married with her instead of he married her.
Ah, yes, the extra preposition strikes again. It's one of the small things that can really affect your fluency.
It can. The verb to marry already implies a connection between two people. So adding with is unnecessary.
It's like saying he walked with his legs. It's already implied, so the correct way is just he married her, nice and simple.
Exactly. And, this mistake probably comes from languages that do use a preposition after to marry, so it's a natural transfer of grammar rules.
It's amazing how our brains try to apply patterns from our native language to English, even when they don't really fit.
It's like our brains are always looking for shortcuts, even if they lead to some unexpected places.
All right, are you ready for this one? It's a classic mix-up of two words that sound similar but mean the opposite. Terrible and terrific.
Oh, that one. Imagine telling someone, I'm afraid of my boss because he's so terrific.
Yeah.
When you mean he's terrible.
Oh, that would be a disaster. One little slip-up and your whole meaning changes.
It does. It shows how important it is to pay attention to even tiny differences in pronunciation.
Yeah, like terrible has a short I sound and terrific has a long I sound.
Exactly. Practicing your pronunciation and listening to how native speakers use these words can really help.
All right. I think it's time for us to take a little break and let our listeners absorb all this.
Sounds good to me.
But don't go anywhere. We've got even more funny English mistakes waiting for you in the final part of our deep dive.
I can't wait.
All right, welcome back. Ready for a few more laughs?
I am. It's amazing how creative people can be with these mistakes.
I know, right? It's like their brains are trying to solve this English puzzle, but the pieces don't always fit the way we expect.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so funny, those unexpected turns and twists.
Okay, let's start with a mistake that's both funny and a little embarrassing, saying, I'm so hot, when you actually mean, I feel hot because of the weather. We talked about this one before, but I think it's worth another look.
It is. It's so easy to get the meaning mixed up.
Like, imagine you're at a party and it's really hot and you say, wow, I'm so hot. The person you're talking to might think you're flirting with them.
Oh, absolutely. It all depends on the context.
Exactly. To avoid any confusion, it's better to be more specific, like, I'm feeling really hot because of the weather.
Or, it's so warm in here.
Right. You got to be careful with those double meanings.
You do.
Okay, let's talk about a mistake that often trips up people who are used to using articles in their native language, leaving out the in phrases like, let's go to bed.
Ah, yes, the tricky article, the. It can be a real challenge.
It's one of those things native speakers do without thinking, but it can be tough for learners.
So, why don't we use the before bed in this case? Well, it's because bed is being used in a more general sense here.
Correct.
It's not about a specific bed. It's about the idea of going to sleep.
It's like an activity or a state of being.
Exactly.
It's those little distinctions that make English so interesting.
They do. They do. Speaking of interesting, let's talk about one of the most common and often hilarious types of English mistakes. Idioms.
Oh yes, idioms. Those phrases that don't make sense if you translate them word for word.
Exactly. Like to kick the bucket. If you take that literally, it sounds pretty strange.
It does. But of course it means to die. It's just one of many idioms that can confuse English learners.
They're like little puzzles you have to figure out.
Because they can add so much flavor to your language.
They do. But they can also be pretty confusing, especially when you're still learning the basics.
So be patient with yourself. It takes time to learn all these idioms.
It does. It does. The best way to learn them is to hear them in real life. Read books, watch movies, talk to people.
The more you're exposed to English, the easier it will be.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to make mistakes. It's all part of the process.
And remember, making mistakes means you're trying, you're learning, and you're pushing yourself.
And that's what matters.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into funny English mistakes, remember to embrace those blunders, learn from them, and laugh along the way.
Laughter makes everything easier.
Thanks for joining us on this linguistic adventure. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the world of language.